Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous and this is part 34 of a 10-part video series where we're learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. In the previous video, I quickly introduced you to the API Explorer. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use it. So let's jump back in. Quick reminder, the whole point of the API Explorer is to document things. Specifically, the API Explorer documents every single object that we use in vRealize Orchestrator. It documents every property of each of those objects, every method of each of those objects, and every action that we define. Now, to get us started here, I've created a little table here that shows us that in the API Explorer, this is just a legend for the different symbols that we're going to see in the API Explorer. So sometimes we're going to see some gray icons, sometimes some purple icons, blue icons, green icons, and this table will explain what they each mean. But let me actually flip over real quickly here to the API Explorer, where we can actually see those very icons that I was talking about. So the first icon, the one that we see up top here, the gray ones, are, well, if we look at our table here, they're described as types, which is not a terribly descriptive description, but here's, in my experience, what you need to know about the gray entries. The main thing you need to know about the gray entries is ignore them. I'll show you why later on, but I've been using Orchestrator for over a decade now, and I generally ignore those gray entries. I'll show you why. Again, not yet, but pretty soon. So instead, let's take a look at the next three colored icons. So there's that purplish, pinkish one, the blue one, and the green one, which we see over here. So the first ones, the pinkish, purplish ones, include objects, definitions for objects that you've perhaps already used. For instance, earlier in this video series, we've talked about issuing JavaScript commands such as system.log or server.log, system.debug, server.debug, and so forth. So if we wanted to find out about the system object or the server object, we would just go into the API Explorer, scroll till we found those, and since they're pink, that means that these are already predefined. They're not coming from a plugin or anything. They're built into Orchestrator itself. And if we look at one of them, such as system, what we see here is a bunch of entries that, in this case, all have solid dots. Let's go take a look at our table to find out what those solid dots are. Well, according to this here, those solid dot entries are describing the methods of the objects. Now, we're going to be talking about properties and methods of objects. The basic idea behind those concepts, if you're not already familiar with object-oriented programming, the basic idea behind those is in object-oriented programming, every single object that we have, whether it's the system object that we're about to look at or a more complex object like a virtual machine, every single object has properties. Properties describe the object. So for instance, the dot name property of a virtual machine tells you the name of the virtual machine. The dot numCPU property of a virtual machine tells you how many CPUs are in that VM. So again, properties provide information about the object itself. On the other hand, methods are they're in effect like functions. They're functions that we can call on the object to get the object to do things. So for instance, with the virtual machine type object, we can call its power on method. Now that may not actually be the name. I'll use the API Explorer here in a little bit to look up the name of that method. That's one of the things I do at the API Explorer is I go and I look up methods whose names I can't remember. Anyways, so now that we know that the hollow dot entries are for properties and the solid dot entries are for methods, let's actually put that into play here over in the API Explorer. Now, as you can see here, the system object has a whole bunch of different methods, including, if you've ever done a system.debug, this entry here describes to you how that method works, what it is, what it does, what parameter it requires, and what return value it returns. And as you can see, we have a whole bunch of different methods, but let me go to the first of these that I showed you long ago, which is system.log. As you can see here, it's telling us that the name of the method is log, lowercase l-o-g, and here in parentheses, it's telling us that that method requires that we supply a single string, which, if you recall using system.log, when we actually type system.log, open parenthesis, we then put within quotes the string that we want logged. Then we close the parenthesis and we type a semicolon. But that's what this line is telling us here. If we actually click on it down below, it gives us more information about the method itself. So the description here says that system.log is used to log a text message in the system at the info threshold. On the other hand, system.debug uses the debug threshold. It tells us here that this particular method returns nothing. So void means it returns nothing. Other methods will return things such as return a string, return a virtual machine, return anything the person who defines the method wants it to return. And then here it tells us that the parameter, the one and only in this case, parameter for system.log is a single string. And again, a little reminder down here, we've got a reminder that this thing returns void. Actually, I should have described this section here a little better before. The signature of a method is its name, what its input parameters are, and what it returns. So one of the key things I do in the API Explorer is to go in here to find the signature of different methods. And in the case of all these here, these are pretty simple. Most of these just take one or two parameters. Other methods may take a whole bunch more, and between you and me, it can be tricky sometimes to remember what all those are. In between being here in the API Explorer and flipping over and typing my code, I can forget that signature. So I'll show you a trick in a little bit for how to make it easy to remember those. Okay, if we keep looking at the system object here, you'll notice that it doesn't have any of those hollow dot entries. The system object does not have any properties. All it has is methods. But that's okay. There's lots of other objects. We'll find some other objects that do have methods and properties and something else called a constructor, which we'll see here in a moment. But let me go back up here and collapse system. So those are some examples of the pinkish purplish entries. Again, those are defined by default. You don't have to install any plugins to get these. These blue ones are also defined in Orchestrator and or the underlying JavaScript engine. We see here, for instance, this blue one called array. If you've ever worked with an array has different different methods you can invoke on it. For instance, you can take an array and you can, let's see, what might you have done before? Perhaps you have used the, how about the slice method to take that array and get just a portion of it returned. Or if you ever have worked with stacks, in JavaScript, an array object can be treated as a stack. So you can push, where's push hiding? You can push and pop things onto an array. But again, this is just an example without worrying about what all these different methods are. Again, you could click on each of these to find out what they do. But what I wanted to show you here is an example of an object, the array object, which has methods, and it has in this case, a single property called length. And the length is the length of the array. So how many elements are in this particular array? Okay, so we've seen some objects with methods. We've seen some objects with properties. Let's go see if we can find an object that has something called a constructor. So let's hunt a little bit more. Well, I happen to know that there is an object hiding a little bit further down. It's one of the green objects, an object called a date object. The date objects are defined by JavaScript, and they allow us to work with dates. So for instance, if you wanted to schedule a task to kick off in the future, or perhaps you have a user interaction and you want it to time out at a certain point in time, you can use date objects for those types of purposes, and lots of others. So let's take a look at what date has. Well, date has some methods. We see the solid dot entries here, and no properties, but this one has methods and special types of methods called constructors. That's what the letter C stands for here. If you're not familiar with object-oriented programming and have never heard the word constructor, it's actually a really simple concept. A constructor is a method, but it's a special method. A constructor is a method that's called in order to create an object. In this case, in the case of all four of these constructor methods here, any of these can be used to create a new date object. And as you can see here, the date object has four constructors that use different combinations of parameters to specify what date you want in the object. So for instance, if you just call date with no parameters, that returns a date object that has the date and time for right now when you call that constructor. On the other hand, these other three constructors allow you, using different formats, to pass in the date and time you want in the date object. So again, the date constructor with no parameters gives you an object that has now in it. The other three allow you to create a date object that has any date time combination that you want in the data object. So those are what constructors are called. Another great example of a constructor method is if you've ever worked with the, the properties object. Now, that name is a little unfortunate. The properties object is not the same thing as these properties. The properties object is, some people call it a hash data structure, or other people might call it a key value pair data structure. We'll talk in other videos about exactly what properties are. But this properties object has a constructor method that allows you to create the properties object. It has some methods to allow you to do things with that object. For instance, I can put things into the object using a key value pair. So the first string is the key. The second is the value that you want to put in. So for instance, I could say the key is first name, comma, and the value is Watrous. Wait, that's my last name. But you get the idea. So the first parameter is the key for the piece of data that you want to put in, and the second parameter is the value. All right, and the properties object here does actually have one property called keys. If you want to know what the keys are that somebody has put into the object, that's what the keys property is for. That way you can go get things back out of the properties object. Now, if you didn't follow the whole business about the properties object, my point here in talking about the properties object is not to get you to understand the properties object 100%, but rather I wanted to make certain that you're aware that there's an object called properties, but that's not the same thing as the properties that we see defined on the different objects. Hopefully that hasn't just confused matters more. But anyways, continuing onwards here, we can also see in our list of icons here that there's some called enumerations and string sets. Let's go find those. As I go hunting for these, I'll tell you right off the bat, I generally ignore these. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. I know I still need to explain to you why I generally ignore the gray entries, but I also ignored these, what are they called? See, I don't even remember what they're called. String sets. I generally ignore them. There's only a handful of them, so priority defines high, normal, low. State, so what state is something in. Again, I personally, in 10 plus years of using Orchestrator, have just never had an opportunity that presented itself where I needed to use these. So if somebody out there uses these and finds them valuable and wants to drop a comment to let me know how you use them, that would be great. But I've never, ever had to use them. I'm going to scroll up here and collapse something here. Hang on. We'll take a look in that vCenter section that I just collapsed in a little bit. Wait, let me collapse it. There we go. Because what I wanted to do is to show you one of the enumerations. So under enums, what you have is a small collection of these things called enumerations. Again, this icon is for enumerations. Again, I don't use these. If you use these and you find them useful and you want to drop a comment in YouTube to tell me how you use them, that'd be great. But in 10 years plus some, I've never really used these. But if I did, it would be to do things like have predefined values for number of CPUs or predefined values for memory sizes. Again, I just haven't found these useful. But there are things I do use in the API Explorer that are tremendously useful. So let's go take a look at what those are. So one of the things that's useful in the API Explorer is the actions that that VMware defines and our third-party vendors that create plugins and even the actions you define are all automatically documented. So if we go looking for actions, we'll find them a little bit above. Here they are. Each of these icons represents an action module. You'll recall modules are used for storing one or more actions. For instance, this randomly selected module here has 4 different actions, and again I can see the signature for each of those. And if whoever defined these actions was a good modular programmer, if they've defined not just given a good name for the action, but also defined descriptions for the action, its inputs, describe those two, then there will be great documentation here describing the action. Again, as long as you pick a good name for your action when you define it, there'll be a nice name here. As long as you type a description for the action, the description will show up here automatically. And the inputs that you set up descriptions for, all that gets documented here. So every single action is documented. But you got to make certain that you're typing descriptions when you define your actions. All right, so those are the actions, but the really useful things in the API Explorer are these entries here that have their own colorful icons. As we can see in our table here, each of those colorful icons is hinting to you which plugin that section of the API Explorer is talking about. Each plugin can provide its own documentation in the API Explorer, and each plugin has its own icon. So for instance, this is the vRA icon, this is the vCenter icon, this is the NSX icon, and this I believe is the SSH icon. If you can't remember the meaning of each of the icons, or in my case, if you can't quite see them because your screen resolution is pretty low, yeah, you can always look at the names. So let's take a look at some of these names here. So this is all the documentation for the Active Directory plugin. So all of its objects, all the properties and methods and constructors for all the 80 objects are described in here. If you're using advanced messaging queuing protocol, we've got it here. We've got documentation for Azure, and so on and so on and so on and so on. But let's actually go take a look at one that a lot of folks start working with in the beginning, which is the vCenter plugin. The vCenter plugin has a ton of objects in it. And one of those, actually a bunch of those, as you can see, have these grayed out entries. But remember I told you that I ignore those. So I'm going to scroll past all those. After all the grayed out entries, you have the entries that we really care about, which is these green entries. Alarm filter, alarm result, alarm type. Obviously, those are going to define objects that are related to vCenter alarms. But not everyone's familiar with alarms, so I'm not going to use that as an example. Instead, what I want to do is to show you the documentation in here that talks about an object that you quite likely will work with very frequently, which is an object that's known in Orchestrator as a VC:\virtual_machine. Now, if you want to, you can go searching for that object by going and looking through this list. But as you can see, the list is super long, and I'm having trouble scrolling around finding things. I suppose I could resize this side here. Now my scrolling won't be quite so crazy. But even if I have a nice big window here to look at all of these different objects defined by the vCenter plugin, it can be challenging to find the very object that you're looking for until you do one of two things. Either you learn how to use the search feature, which I'll show you how to do in a moment, or if you don't know how to use the search feature, please learn from my painful experience and notice, if you will, that these are all alphabetized. I went an embarrassingly long amount of time in my Orchestrator career before I finally realized these are alphabetized. Once you know they're alphabetized, it's easier to find the object you're looking for, but it still takes a little time. So let's see, I'm looking for VC virtual machine. So I scroll and scroll and scroll. Let's see, that's VC firewall, VC guest operating system. And I'm just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling until I find, the network's getting a little slow here, until I find, where is it? VCT, VCU. Here we go. So now we're in the ballpark. So VCV app, VCV flash cache. Let's see, we're looking for VC virtual machine. Getting close. VCV. Closer. VC virtual. Almost there. Okay, and here it is. Here is VC virtual machine. If I expand this, we'll learn all sorts of information about that object, its properties, its methods, and so forth. But notice before we even look in there that there are a whole bunch of objects in the vCenter plugin that are related to a VC virtual machine. So there's also VC virtual machine affinity info for things like DRS affinity info rules, and randomly selecting some other ones, VC virtual machine CD-ROM info, and the list goes on and on and on. There are tons of different objects that are related to virtual machines. In the beginning, just ignore all these specialized ones. The one you really care about in the beginning, in most cases, is VC virtual machine. And as I said before, if you expand, you can see all the properties. So for instance, here is the, where's it hiding? Here's the, these are alphabetized. Here is the property, the .name property, which is where the name of the virtual machine is stored. And additionally, we also have all the methods we can invoke on a virtual machine, including, earlier I mentioned a power on method. I have to confess, I never remember whether it's called power on or start or stop, or obviously it's not called stop, but let's go see if we can find it here. So PQR, is it power? It is in fact power on and power off. I think it's the workflow names that aren't power on, power off. The Orchestrator, excuse me, the vCenter plugins name for the workflow that powers on a VM, I think is called start VM and wait. But anyways, these are the methods that you can use to power on and power off a virtual machine. Incidentally, if you don't understand what I'm about to say, it's totally fine. But for those of you who know what asynchronous means, the methods in the vCenter plugin, the methods that have names that end in _task are asynchronous methods. You call that method, and instead of waiting for the method to complete running, we invoke it asynchronously. The method starts running, and instead of waiting for that method, you get back a task object. So you can go look in the API Explorer to see the task object. But when you call an asynchronous method, you get back a task object. We don't wait for the method to complete running. Therefore, your workflow can go off and do whatever it wants. And if it wants to check in later on to see how the asynchronously launched method is doing, you can look at the task object. Perhaps if I remember towards the tail end of this video, I'll show you that task object that I keep alluding to. But I want to show you something else that's even more important that will save you a ton of time. So now that we know how to manually scroll through and find all the different object types, you have likely noticed in several instances that, especially when working with the vCenter plugin with its 100+ different objects, that finding the exact object you're looking for can be a bit challenging if you're trying to manually scroll through and find them. So let's talk about how you can use the search functionality to find things more easily. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to look up the object definition for the thing I've been talking about called a VC::virtual, helps if you type it correctly, virtual machine. By the way, I assume these are case sensitive. I'm a crusty old Unix guy. I assume everything's case sensitive. I always type it capitalized this way. But notice if I search for VC::virtual machine, watch what happens. So I'll hit search, and what do I get back? For me, what I get back is nothing. Right now, you're looking at this and you're saying, no, Brian, you got back a bunch of entries. But for me, I don't see anything here because, as I said before, I ignore all these gray dot entries. And in fact, when you search the way I just did, all you're going to get back is gray dot entries. And as I said in the beginning of this video, I don't care about those gray dot entries. And I'll explain why right now. So for instance, let's go find VC virtual machine. Again, I don't care about all these specialized ones. I'm looking specifically for VC virtual machine. It's probably at the top or the bottom. Where is it hiding? So there, it's on the bottom. Now notice what happens when I work with a gray dot entry. If I go look at VC::virtual machine, double click it, it shows up over on the top left-hand side of the screen, and you'll notice that there's no little expand triangle here because these gray dot entries, these type entries are not the actual object itself. It just gives a brief description of the object. So down below, I can see information about the properties of the object, but I don't see any of the methods. So if you look at the gray.entries, you're not going to get a complete view of what the object is all about. You can quickly jump from a gray.entry to the green.entry by simply clicking on this link down here. So notice if I click this link in the top left, it jumps to that object. So I can go from a gray entry to a green entry, but ultimately I just want to see the green entry. So in order to save myself time, I have trained myself to do searches in a particular way to avoid those gray dot entries. And the way you do this is really quite simple. Instead of searching for VC:\virtual_machine, if you just get rid of the colon, just search for VC object name instead of VC:\object name, you'll notice that VC object name finds the green dot entries, which are the ones I care about. So instead of having to do 2 hops through the gray dot entry, actually 2 hops, 1 hops, however many hops, instead of having to go through the gray entry to get to the green entry, the one that I really care about, I just have trained myself to search in a way that's faster. So let's take a look at one more thing before we move on. As you can see here, I am looking at VC:\virtual_machine. Let me expand it. And as I said before, if I wanted to take a look at a VC:\virtual_machine object and find out what the name of the VM that's stored in that object, I could look at again, these are alphabetized. I could just look at the .name property of that object. Ta-da, there it is. Earlier I told you the name of another property, which was the .numCPU property, which stores the number of CPUs in this virtual machine. But as you can see here, since these are alphabetized, the .numCPU property should be showing up right here, but it's not there. So what's going on? Well, maybe if we go look up here at CPU, well, CPU, no, that's not the number of CPUs. That's just going to give a string describing the CPUs. So for instance, a string like this is an Intel whatever CPU. So cut to the chase here. You're not going to find the number of CPUs in a VC:\virtual_machine object itself. And this is a real important point for, this definitely applies to the vCenter plugin, may apply to other plugins, but with the vCenter plugin, the vCenter plugins object called the VC:\virtual_machine, conceptually, that object holds all the information that you would ever need to know about a virtual machine. But in reality, as we've seen, based on the fact that we saw these other related objects, the truth of the matter is that a VC:\virtual_machine is an object that has properties that point to other objects that in turn may have properties that point to other objects. So if I want to find the number of CPUs, I can find it, but that information is not stored in the VC:\virtual_machine object itself. So I'm going to show you here how you could find out the number of CPUs. You won't find it if you just have a VC:\virtual_machine object, but if you have a VC:\virtual_machine object and look at its config property, that's going to be heading the right way. We won't get there in one step, but the config object, as we see down below, is pointing to an object of type VC:\virtual_machine config info. So configuration information about the virtual machine is stored in the object that this config property is pointing to. So if we wanted to, we could go manually search for VC:\virtual_machine config info by scrolling up and down up above here, but you've already seen how clumsy I am at doing that. So instead of scrolling, I'm just going to click on VC:\virtual_machine info, VC:\virtual_machine config info, and it's taking me to VC:\virtual_machine config info, which if I expand that, we can see it too has a whole bunch of properties. So this configuration information object that VC Virtual Machine points to through its config property has tons of information. Again, we don't have time to talk about each of these. I'm just trying to show you a real world example. In the config info structure, there is a property called hardware, which is where the object that property is pointing to is where we're going to find the number of CPUs. So what type of object is a hardware object? Well, what type of object is the hardware property pointing to? It's pointing to a VC virtual hardware object. So let's go look at that. So if we look at that, here's VC virtual hardware. There is a property called numCPU. And notice, if you will, the capitalization. All these method names and property names and constructor names are case sensitive. So I'm going to pay real close attention here. The name of the method is numCPU. So with that, we can see that numCPU, as it says down below, lets us know how many CPUs is in this virtual machine. On the other hand, if you want to know how much memory is in the virtual machine, you can look at the .memoryMB property. So there's lots of different properties here. Another really useful one is this object called device. Device is an array of VC virtual devices. Every single piece of virtual hardware that you have in your virtual machine is accessible through the array that this .device property is pointing to. So super duper useful. But to close out this particular video, I'm going to show you how to put some of this information into practice in some live on the fly workflow creation. If you'd like to jump ahead to the next video, in the next video I'm going to show you, it's actually titled the API Explorer, but in reality in the next video I'm going to show you an alternative to the API Explorer. So if you want to skip the rest of this video, totally fine. I'll see you over in the next video. But if you stick around for the rest of this video, let me show you live how I can put to use some of this information. So we just found out that the .numCPU property of a virtual machine tells us how many CPUs are in that VM. So let's actually create a workflow that makes use of that. So I'm going to bring up the vRO client. Let's see, I'll go into design view. I'll go to workflows, and let me just create a new workflow. Let's see, I'll put it in the examples folder. A new workflow called the API Explorer. Helps if you type it correctly. EXPLORER. The API Explorer is awesome. Anyways, here I am creating a new workflow, and what I'm going to do is create a variable called VM. And as you might guess from the name, this variable is going to hold a virtual machine, or more accurately, it's going to hold a VC virtual machine object. Now I could create that VM variable lots of different ways. I'm going to do this a nice simple way. I'm just going to go create an input parameter. So I'm going to inputs, I click on the add button, and in here I'll call this variable VM. If we hit OK, I now have a variable called VM, but I don't want that variable to be a string. That string would be useful if I was doing something like looking up a VM by its name. But if I was doing that, I wouldn't have called it VM, I would have called it VM name. I'm not looking to have a variable here that's just for referring to the VM by name. I want a variable called VM that holds every single piece of information I might ever need to know about that VM, all of its properties and all of its methods. So I'm going to change the type. Instead of doing a string, let's do a VC virtual machine. Again, the list is alphabetized. In this case here, up at the top, we find VC virtual machine. And again, just as a quick reminder, if you search for VC virtual machine in the API Explorer, you're going to find the grayed out entries that I ignore. So even though it's VC virtual machine here, over in the API Explorer, if I was looking for the definition of this object, I would search for for VC virtual machine without the colon. Anyways, I'm going to change its type to VC colon virtual machine, and so that the user knows what I'm asking for here, I'm going to type a description. We'll just make this description virtual machine. We're asking the user to pick a virtual machine. So if we run the workflow that we have so far by simply creating a variable called VM and defining its type to be VC colon virtual machine, when the user runs this workflow, the inputs screen pops up and it asks them to pick a virtual machine by clicking here. And then presumably not by now, you've seen me do this in other videos. I'll just scroll down, I'll drill down through the hierarchy to find a virtual machine. For instance, how about this VM called QA Linux 01? So the user would select that and they'd click submit. But if they do that, it's going to be boring right now because our workflow isn't going to do anything with that input parameter. So let's do something with that input parameter based on information that we saw in the API Explorer. So for instance, I can drag out a scriptable task. And what I want to do to start with is to feed into the scriptable task the VM object that we just defined. So I'm going to go to Visual Binding, and I'm going to bring in that virtual machine, specifically that VC colon virtual machine object that's holding the VM that the user selected. So if I do that much, now I can go over to the scripting tab and I can say exciting things like system.log, number of, actually let's do the VM name first. So the VM name is, click VM, VM.name. By the way, if you can't remember the property names, the API Explorer over here or the API Explorer here can help you to find the property names if you've forgotten them. Alternatively, if you type an object followed by a dot and type control space, you get a, what is that? A scrolly thingy, whatever it's called. You get a list, that's probably a better name, a list of all of these green items and red items, which are properties. So for instance, where's the properties and the methods. So in this case, methods are green and properties are red. Now, one thing that you may be noticing here that I was just stammering over is there it is. Okay, I couldn't see the name property. I was wondering where it disappeared to. It's right there. I just hadn't scrolled down far enough. But anyways, you can use this contextually sensitive pop-up list to pick the name of the property that you want to work with. In this case, we want to work with the vms.name property. So this code here, as I'm sure you've already figured out, will allow us to find out the name of the virtual machine that the user selected. But we can do other things. For instance, if we want to know how many CPUs are in that virtual machine, we could say vm.config.hardware.numCPU. Again, remember, these are case sensitive. And similarly, if I want to know how much memory is in that virtual machine, I can use the memoryMB property. That's not in that property is not in the VC colon virtual machine object. It's buried down in several objects. So you got to go through the config property to the hardware property to get to the memoryMB property. But then you can find out the amount of memory or other exciting things about the virtual machine. So having done this, let's actually run this workflow here. So I'll run the workflow. I'm going to pick a VM. Let's see, just randomly picking a VM. Why don't we go for that QA Lin VM again? Don't actually know what that VM is, but it'll work for our purposes. So QA-Linux 01, if we select it, well, interesting. We already can see over here in the inventory how much memory the VM has. And if I scroll down, it'll also tell me how many CPUs, but let's ignore that. Because my job isn't to show you how the user can see how much memory is in the VM. My job is to show you how you, in your workflow with some JavaScript code, can see the number of CPUs. So I'm just going to select this VM. I'll click Submit, and when the workflow runs, we'll go to its Logs tab, and sure enough, we can see here we are printing out the name of the VM, the number of CPUs, and the amount of memory. So that's one example of using the API Explorer. Another example that you ought to be aware of, or another thing about this that you should be aware of is if ever you're calling one of these constructor methods or one of the plain old methods, they sometimes have complex signatures. If you're doing as I do, working with the big separate API Explorer window, and you flip over here and you've forgotten the signature, that can be a problem. Or even if you're using the API Explorer that's embedded into the editor, even though I'm not going to have any problems remembering the signature, I don't think I want to type this whole thing. So let me show you a trick. Whether it's a method or a constructor method or a plain old method, if you right-click and the method and choose copy, then later on when you want to use that method, you can just paste in the method that you copied over, which in that case, that was numCPU. I thought I copied this one. Hang on. Right-click VC virtual hardware, and let me paste that in. Control V. There we go. So the copy functionality is really useful when the method you're working with has a long signature. All right, so what else do we have here? There's a ton of things I could show you about the API Explorer, but one other thing I wanted to make certain I showed you is related to asynchronous methods in the vCenter plugin. We saw earlier, let me see if I can find it again. We saw earlier when we were looking at VC Virtual Machine. Where's VC Virtual Machine hiding? So down on the bottom. We were looking at VC Virtual Machine. Here he is. And not quite certain why I've lost where's the left side of my screen? Hang on. Where did it go? My API Explorer is acting a little bit strange here. Hang on a second here while I restart the API Explorer. And I don't care about this here, so I'm going to dismiss that. I'm going to start the API Explorer real quickly here. And I'm going to, well, I don't have to search because it's already in the ballpark of where I'm looking. So I was telling you earlier that VC Virtual Machine has a method called PowerOn VM_task. So if with that VM variable that we had before, we could say VM.PowerOn VM_task, and in the parentheses pass in optionally the host that we want the VM to power up on. But whether we pass in that host or we don't, that method returns a task object. So let's go look up a task object. So task object, specifically a VC task object. So a VC task object is hiding right here. A VC task object is what you get back whenever you call a asynchronous method. And what that task object has in terms of properties is useful things like, what is the state of that method I called? So is it still running? Did it complete running? Did it fail? Did it succeed? Is it waiting for user interaction? All sorts of information like that is available in the state property. Plus, we also have interesting methods for tasks, such as if you wanted to cancel a task, you'd call the cancel task method. Or if it's April Fool's Day and you want to mess around with your coworkers, you can use the update progress bar method to make that progress bar do all sorts of interesting things. Again, fun on April Fool's Day. But that's what that task object is about. It comes in real handy when you're using the vCenter plugin's asynchronous methods. So let's see. Again, we've talked about a bunch of things. This was video number 34. In the next video, video 35, what we're going to be talking about is kind of related to the API Explorer, but specifically what we'll be doing is talking about something that you'll use sometimes instead of the API Explorer. So I'll see you in the next video.